Well, we're very pleased to see Elly here this evening or this late afternoon. 10 months late for Newton St Sires because she was booked for Newton St Sires last March, and her lecture was to come up just at that time when it was shall we, shan't we? And we decided against it. So we're very pleased that she's able to do it tonight. Elly has been keen on doing research since she was 14 years old, and thinking that she got into genealogy at that time, thinking that she enjoyed a problem. The poorhouse in Newton St Sires has been a mystery to us for many years. So we wondered whether she'd be able to solve it for us. Today's talk will be a bit more generalized than she was going to give to Newton St Sires, but don't go away, Newton St Sires, because you will be mentioned. I've told her what my theory is, but she's been very close on hers, and I don't know. So hoping to find out. Okay, Elly.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share screen and see if we get the, oopsie, not that one. Share screen, share. There we go. Right, that should be visible to you all, is it? Yes. Okay, so I was going to entitle this talk Providing for the Poor in some Mid Devon parishes, but when I looked at all the little bits and pieces that I was going to put together to illustrate aspects of providing for the poor, I've changed it to caring for the poor, because I think in Mid Devon parishes, because people were known to the overseers of the poor, etc., they took a lot of care over their poor. And I can only portend to be a bit of an expert on one of these villages, and that's where I live, Cheriton Fitzpaine. But I'm dipping into Stockley English, Cruz, Morchard, Cadbury, and Newton St Sires, just to illustrate some of those aspects. And I know there are people listening today who are experts in each of those villages, so don't shoot me down in flames, but maybe I might awaken some interest in you to take certain aspects a little bit further. Oh, how do I move my slide on, Mark?
Click on your screen and then you should be able to use the arrow keys to move the slides.
Oh, done it. Thank you. So I want to dispel this sort of picture we've got about workhouses and the poor that we've generally got from Charles Dickens' writings, and particularly from the film Oliver Twist. Those workhouses were very much corralling lots of people from different villages into towns and cities. They were dealing with large numbers of people. They didn't have finite resources. They were very impersonal, and therefore they did get this reputation of being quite punitive places. There was a deterrent to people going there. They didn't want you to be there. And generally, if you went, you'd probably stayed there until you died, unless you were apprenticed out. So it's very, very different in the parishes themselves, thank goodness. Now, there's a theory that in centuries gone by, you would get your support if you were poor from the monasteries. And if you know Winchester and you know St Cross, the monastery, that the hospital there, you can still knock on their window and get something called Wayfarer's Dole, which is a small drink of ale and a hunk of bread. Of course, you could go there if you needed food and water and drink. You could go there if you were ill and if you were elderly, because they generally would look after the poor there and in a sort of hospital wing. And in fact, St Cross in Winchester still looks after 25 elderly gentlemen, I believe. So if you hold that theory that that's where most people got their sustenance from, what happened when Henry VIII actually dissolved the monasteries? Immediately it wipes away their support network, and where are people going to go? Now, the reality of it is, in Mid Devon, we don't have any monasteries. And if you're poor, you certainly haven't got the wherewithal to get out of your village and go and find one. So I think what happened always in Mid Devon and other parishes around Devon was that you were looked after in your own community, unofficially, by neighbours, by your extended family, by members of the church, and by anyone who left money in their will. And I think that's how we've always looked after the people who needed it, because they were part of our community. If you look at this, it's an example of someone who had been the vicar of Cheriton Fitzpaine, Thomas Reynolds. In his 1559 will, he leaves money for bringing up poor children in virtue and learning, i.e. education. He leaves some of his money to marry poor men and maidens together, to pay for their outfits and to pay for the ceremony and pay for the jolly afterwards. And he recognised that a lot of folk in the village couldn't look after their own children. They had too many children, and he left money to those who were already burdened by many children. And who would distribute this money? It wouldn't be anybody official, it would be their executors. Here's another example. This is another member of the Reynolds family who was a yeoman farmer in that same village. And if you've done any genealogy at all and you've looked at wills, you'll know there's a statutory little phrase in most people's wills, hoping to buy themselves a place in heaven. If you look down where the star is here, most people would leave a little bit to the poor. Here by that purple star, it says, item, I give to the poor of Cheriton Fitzpaine 20 shillings. And again, it wasn't anybody official or a body that would distribute that money, it would be your executors. So I think that's how things happened there in those centuries gone by, rather than this theory of the monasteries being the main source of support. Of course, in the 16th century, there were an awful lot of people who did need poor support. There had been a war, and therefore, if you had been killed in the war, you left a widow and children who needed support. If you hadn't been killed and you'd been injured in some way, you certainly couldn't work and do manual labour on the land. And there had also been poor harvests, so people were starving to death. So there were many people going from village to village and town to town begging, and they were called vagrants. There hadn't really been a system yet to identify who they were and what they needed. There was also a belief that those vagrants were probably idle. And Henry VIII put together some of his laws in what was called the Vagabond Act in 1531, where, yes, he did identify some people as being unable to work because they were too old, they were sick, or they were injured. And they could go under this act to the JP and ask for a license to beg. So that was okay. But the others, the people who were able-bodied and didn't work, were still termed vagrants, and they had to be publicly humiliated by being whipped in the village and sent back to their place of birth. Now, when Henry finished his reign and we've got Edward VI, it becomes far more punitive. And under the Vagrancy Act of 1547, if you were able-bodied, you wouldn't just be humiliated in public, you would be branded like an animal with the letter V for vagrant, and you would be enslaved for a couple of years. So it was a real deterrent, but it was very punitive. And if you were a poor child, yes, the Act allowed for you to be offered up for apprenticeship, but what that meant then, because there was no real setup to make sure that the right thing happened, those children were really enslaved as well. That act didn't last for long, and it was repealed after about 3 years, and we reverted to that 1531 Vagabond Act. When Elizabeth passed this next act, which was towards the end of her reign in 1598, it was the Act for the Relief of the Poor. By that time, I think she was marshalling all the things that had been set up and put in place to support poor people into some sort of order. Some sort of system was evolving by then. The money that would support the poor would be the poor rate, which was levied from those people who could afford it, people who had property and land, And overseers of the poor were appointed because it was their job then to make sure that this not finite pot of money was then distributed to the right people. And the onus upon them was to support their own, the people who belonged to their parish, not just to anybody. Yes, they supported the sick. Yes, they supported children, disabled and elderly. And 2 or 3 years later, there's a real identification of those people who deserved the poor relief and those people who didn't. So in 1601, you've got a very clear definition. If you were deserving poor, you were people who had been incapacitated in some way, or you were elderly, and you could be given shelter. You'd have a roof over your head, either in a poorhouse or some sort of almshouse. And if you were a poor child, you would be apprenticed out, but the onus upon the master who apprenticed you was that you would they would be taught a skill. And that's very open-ended. There's an end in sight, because when the apprenticeship was over, the idea was that that poor child would have some sort of skill and could support themselves as an adult. The converse of that is, if you were able-bodied, you didn't get away with it, you had to do work if you needed support, and the materials would be provided. And if you were totally idle and refused work, you would be sent to a house of, I like this, correction. It wasn't a house of punishment. I'm sure it wasn't an easy ride there, but again, there's an open-endedness about this. There's an expectation that you will be corrected and you can then be out in society again supporting yourself. So you can see how the order is coming little by little into some sort of system. So we know that there wasn't a finite pot of money from the poor rate, which was collected in each parish. So it became necessary in 1662 to pass the Settlement Act. And if the person didn't belong to your village, they couldn't be chargeable to your village. You didn't have to support them. So they were removed by a constable to the village where they did belong, so that those people had to pay for them. And this act set out for settlement to be something about the place you were born, or the place your husband was born, or the place in which you had been apprenticed. So there's a clarification there that you were still looking after your own. And if you were looking after your own, you wanted to identify them. So you badged them. 1697, this act allowed for the badging of the paupers that you were supporting. In Crediton Library, this is from the Overseers of the Poor account, you can see paid for making the badges and half a yard of red cloth and sewing on the letters. The person was paid 1 shilling and 11 pence for doing that. So I know in our village there was a blue badge with red lettering. It would be CF, the Crediton Library, and then the letter P. And generally it was sewn onto the shoulder of the coat or the cloak or the jacket. It wasn't a stigma so much as an identification, just to say, yes, we're helping this person at the moment. Sometimes people went a little bit further, and John Heel sent me these 2 illustrations the other day of Crediton Poorhouse. I'll just explain first of all that if you go along that little road to the right of the church where the Boniface Centre is and on to where the car park is, beyond that lies the vicarage. And in the vicarage environs, there used to be the poorhouse. It must have been quite large because it did have quite a lot of work opportunity for the pensioners who were there. And by pensioner, I don't mean elderly. A pensioner is just the person who was in the poorhouse. They were employed in brewing in the brew house, spinning, combing wool in the combing shop, and they had 20 looms to weave serges. And this is the bit, weaving serges for the poor to be dyed red. So if they were walking around Crediton, they were wearing red serge. You know, immediately when I found this out, I have echoes of The Handmaid's Tale. and Gilead, people walking around very much badged. So they were very evident to the rest of the public that they were receiving poor support. I'll skittle through the next few poor laws just so you know I haven't ignored them. But to be honest, in my research in our villages, I haven't actually found these spelled out or mentioned, but obviously they did underpin some of what went on. So 1723, the Workhouse Test Act, which is also called Natchball's Act, said that if you wanted poor relief, you had to go into the poorhouse and you had to work. Within that act, there's a very interesting clause. I'll read it out. It's in red there. It allowed for poor relief could be subcontracted out to those that would feed, clothe, and house the poor in return for a weekly rate from the parish. It's a sort of fostering system, really. So if you were a villager in a cottage, didn't have to own the house, you'd be paying rent on it yourself, and you could offer some sort of shelter and sustenance, you could get an allowance for that. Now, that might come in later, handy later in the talk. 1782 Gilbert's Act, that provided for you to be put into a poorhouse, and it regularised what they call outdoor relief, which is paying a sum of money weekly to someone just to keep them above the breadline, and they're living in their own cottage. And finally, I want to mention the Sphenum land system. Again, I can't find it named in any of our parishes. It's started in Berkshire and it's supposed to have spread across the south of England in 1795, but I'm sure they did adhere to what it said. Basically, if there was a poor harvest and grain prices shot up, the overseers of the poor were duty bound to give a larger amount of money to the poor so that it was proportional. So how do we know about those parishes and what went on? Well, here's a nice parish chest here. The documents which meant anything to the parish, the official documents, would be kept in here with the registers. This one's got 3 locks on it, 1 for the vicar and 2 for the church wardens. And those records are overseers of the poor accounts and receipts for work done, examinations, bastardy bonds, removal orders and settlement certificates, and apprenticeship records. Now, you'll be very lucky if your parish has got all of those and that they have been deposited safely in the strong rooms of the Devon Heritage Centre. They survive very piecemeal. If you think about dampness, if you think about rodents nibbling them, there have been instances of fires, of theft, and just general losing them. They may still exist in parishes, not in the parish chest, but in the church safe or in the vicarage safe. Sometimes you find they've been scattered around the parish. People who are interested have taken them and looked at them to study them and never given them back. So really, we're lucky we've got them at all, but that's where you would find these stories. They're the sort of things I used to visit when I was a teenager doing my family tree. I would write to the vicar, I'd travel to the parish and he'd open the parish chest and I could handle all of these paper and parchment documents. It sets my heart on fire to see them. And that's why I became an archivist after I'd done that sort of research in my teenage years. I'm just amazed that I can hold something that's been written by a person 200 or 300 years ago, and the facts are there. And when you look at the facts, they release a story about real people who lived in that parish. They just come alive. So I'm so grateful that they have survived piecemeal by, not as well as they should have done. If you know of any that do exist where you live, will you please urge people to deposit them, because they're kept in the Devon Heritage Centre for other people to look at for the future. They're kept in fireproof surroundings, theft-proof, and in humidity-controlled atmospheres. And if they need to be repaired, they are repaired. I tell this story, which you might have heard before. When I was first an archivist in Hampshire, one of the parishes, this is in the early 1970s, a new vicar had arrived, and he'd cleared out all the things he didn't think were useful. He kept the registers, but all this sort of stuff that had been in the parish chest, he threw out with the rubbish. By the time this was discovered, it was about 2, 3, 4, 5 feet under other rubbish on the municipal dump. And the record office had to get diggers out to dig down through this stinking pile of rubbish to try and extract as many of these records as they could, take them back to the record office, wash the ones they could that had Gallic ink on them, and to fumigate the rest of them, and to hang them up on washing lines for weeks to try and naturally dry. They didn't find more than 10% of what had been thrown out. So these are precious, precious documents. They may not be the registers, but they tell a story. So let's have a look at provision or care in the parishes in terms of housing and shelter. I've put in these pictures from around the country of church houses. And church houses generally were constructed along the side of a churchyard, very close to the church. They generally had an upstairs room, which you could access from an external staircase. And they were multi-purpose parish rooms, really. The little rooms upstairs were generally kept aside to act as a vestry or a little schoolroom, or where the manorial courts could meet, and where outdoor relief could be distributed. Some of the building might be given over to what we call like a parish hall for church ales and celebrations, but this is where the poor would be housed, dormitories and workrooms. Quite often they're very long buildings. And here's an example of one in Cheriton Fitzpaine. You've got the church here and the churchyard, and to the right here, this long pink building here was constructed as the poorhouse. It's quite a late construct, it's 1648. And this used to be the village green, Church Hay, and lots of little houses were constructed about the same date, which were for people who were okay, they were working, but they were paying rent to the trustees, and the trustees would use that rent to help subsidise the running of the poorhouse. It's a perfect system, really. Here is that poorhouse. It's supposedly the longest thatch building in the south of England. But if you look at the roof line, you'll see there are 3 different levels along here. To this end, there's a huge bread oven that sticks out into the churchyard. Unfortunately, internally, there's absolutely no evidence of it. And the southern end of it is jettied, and it runs across the trim tram path. After about 100 years, it needed renovations and updating. Here it is when it became a school and it was being renovated and updated. And here's the external staircase going up to the little room I told you quite obviously isn't a vestry at that stage, it's the head teacher's office. And here is the overseer's account of how much that 1758 renovation involved. Great source of information if you've got somebody living in that village who you knew was a craftsman. We've got Hugh Moxey for 50 sheaves of reed, John Drake for 300 of needles. John Drake paid ditto for thatching the church house, and I like this bit, spent on the thatcher when it was late. A little bit of overtime there. You've also got spars and binders. You've got 5 locks, and towards the end of this page, you've got planking boards and nails. So I mentioned the church rate being collected. This again is a great source of information if you're wanting to follow the history of your house, because the overseers of the poor would collect that poor rate, sorry, not church rate, poor rate, in the same order each time. So if you know your house was next to a certain one which is named, then you'll be able to identify it on these lists. You can also notice the size of the property by the amount of poor rate that was levied upon them. I'll just read a few of these out. The occupiers of Hayne Barton, Abraham Langbridge for Stockerdon, Abraham Langbridge for Grew, the occupiers of Dennis's Cottage. So if you knew that your house was next to Grew and Stockerdon, that was Dennis's Cottage then. The occupiers of Smith Hayne, Andrew Payne for Upham. So that's the levy of the poor rate. What's it spent on? Well, let's have a look at some of the outdoor relief that was distributed. This is the weekly rate that was given to people who weren't in the poorhouse but who needed money from the overseers of the poor in order to keep them subsisting. Where we've got Edith Kerslake for 13 months and 3 weeks, James Smith and his wife for 10 months and 1 week, Mary Smith, widow, for 3 months and 3 weeks. And then I mentioned apprenticeship briefly. The children would reach a certain age in the poorhouse and then they would be apprenticed out to learn a skill, with the end product being that they had enough knowledge to keep themselves in work when they were adults. So here the overseers of the poor were binding out apprentices. We've got, for example, at the top, Elizabeth Jones, apprenticed with Thomas in Fursdon, who's a lady farmer, and we've got Joanne Upham with Agnes Vesey, William Winter with Richard Parkhouse. And if you notice those two female farmers, it was often the case that if your husband died and you had a small holding, you stepped up and you ran that yourself as a woman until your son was old enough to take over, or until your daughter married and your son-in-law could take over. The apprenticeship system. Generally, boys were apprenticed until they were 24 at the latest, but quite often it was just for 7 years. And girls would be apprenticed until they were married off or until they were 20 or 21 years old. If you think about it, you're apprenticing your neighbour's children. They've fallen on hard times. They're in your small community. So it's in your best interest to give them adequate food and clothing and lodging and to teach them a skill. Agricultural villages, it would generally just be agricultural work, husbandry and looking after geese and cheese making and things like that. They would be working alongside you when they were adults, so you really did want to do a good job. If you want another picture of how apprentices were not looked after well, I would point you in the direction of the book that Liz Shakespeare has published, which is called The Song of the Skylark. It's set in Buckland Brewer, which is near Torrington, and it's about an outlying farm, not in the centre of a village where anyone could keep an eye on it, where the apprentices were treated appallingly. It's beautifully written and it really will open up for you the picture of how it could be. I think the worst that would happen in a small rural village where apprentices were taken in by farmers was that the farmer's son might get a girl apprentice pregnant. That did happen. But there would be no stigma. It was just another person to add to the workforce. So they were poor, so they would go and have the baby in the workhouse, the poorhouse. This is, again, I'm afraid it's Cheriton at the beginning here. The overseers would pay for Mary Back to be laid in, lying in. Swaddling clothes were bought for her baby. They paid for the child's upkeep for 6 months because as soon as she had the baby, the woman would go out into the community again and start work and would present herself each week with a penny or two to help the child's upkeep. If the father was identified, he too would have to bring that money to the poorhouse, but the poorhouse would agree to look after them. Now, Mary Back's child didn't fare so well because after 6 months, it obviously died. So the overseers had to pay for the lying out of the baby, to pay for a coffin to be made, and for the grave to be dug. It's a sad little case. The overseers were quite canny, really, because if they could find the unmarried mother's partner or father of the child, they would often pay for the marriage. And in that way, they rid themselves of having to look after anybody, really. And here's an example. That top star there says, expenses of Robert Blackmore's marriage. Now, that marriage took place 2 months after his child was born. And we know it's his child because it says so in the baptism records. But they, however, had to look after Mary Blackmore's child for that couple of months at the cost of 2 shillings. That was 1770 that took place. That was quite common. Good way to rid yourself of having to support that child until the age of apprenticeship, really. I found a lovely example of a real misuse of this. Cruz Morchard, William Gosland. By everybody's account, he was a simpleton, and he was approached by the overseers of the poor of the neighbouring parish, Cheriton Fitzpaine, to ask him if he'd like to get married. And they'd pay for it. They'd pay for a new suit of clothes, they'd pay for the ceremony and for the knees up afterwards, and he'd get a wife, Mary Ellis. Only 2 days earlier, she had given birth to a daughter. He agreed quite willingly, and I think she was quite pleased, really, to be married off. And they both must have moved to Cruz Morchard because then they became chargeable to that parish poor rate. They had 2 children together. Now, we know that William Gosland in no way could be the father, A, because he didn't even know Mary to begin with, and because there was a court case. Mary Ellis had been a servant girl up at Upcott Barton, and the elderly master or landowner, Daniel Tremlett, had impregnated her. And he was taken to court for what he did, but he had persuaded the overseers of the poor to pay for this marriage and just to get this stranger in to marry her off. It's quite a funny story, really, but he wasn't a very nice man, Daniel Tremlett, by all accounts. You see, these are just words on a page, and you manage to get the story just jumping out at you. That was 1791. So we've had a brief look at some housing. We'll look at more of it in a minute. A little bit about apprenticeship, a little bit about looking after unmarried mothers and looking after children. This is going the extra mile, and this is what our parishes did because they were looking after their own. You wouldn't get it in the Union Workhouse because that was an impersonal place. Herman Taylor, he was just an ordinary working poor labourer in the north of the parish. He was married to Catherine. They had 4 children. He wasn't at that stage falling on the poor relief. But do you remember I showed you a couple of wills where people had bequeathed money for the poor? Daniel Tucker had done this, and Daniel Tucker's bequest, his executors had chosen to distribute 6pence to Herman in 1716. That kept him going. He obviously had enough work on the land. He didn't come and ask for any more money from Tucker's fund until 1722. So he was one of those poor people who was just about managing. He was topped up every now and again from this bequest. But then something awful must have happened. Disaster struck. I only found out what happened much later when I was following his story. But he was taken into the poorhouse, and the overseers of the poor took charge of him and the family. And this very strange thing happened. The overseers of the poor sent him, Herman and Catherine, to Rose Ash, which is 15 miles away. They sent them by horse and cart. They already bought a suit of clothing for him and cleaned him up. And then they paid for this couple to stay for quite a considerable time in the quarters next to the rectory in Rose Ash, being cared for by the Reverend Dr. Lewis Southcombe and his son, also called Lewis Southcombe. Well, even the journey and the clothing of him and everything like that cost 3 and 6pence, but goodness knows what went on while they were being housed in these quarters. What were the Southcombes about? How come an ordinary poor labourer was being sent to have some sort of treatment at parish expense? Well, the Southcombes were quite astounding for their time. And I found out about how they tackled anybody who was ill from this book, which was published a few years later by The Sun. It was called Peace of Mind and Health of Body, published in 1750. And this is what Southcombe believed. I'll quote, "He did not hold the insane person responsible any more than if he had a fever, and held the opinion that madness could proceed either from a wounded spirit or a disordered body." So Herman had had a breakdown. This poor labourer had had a breakdown and was insane. What sort of treatment did he get? Well, when I looked into it, the Southcombes believed that if you played music to a troubled soul, it would help soothe them. If you read regularly to them from the Bible and made sure they went to church, you gave them a belief system. And talking therapy was really important to them, especially if it involved the wife of the person who was afflicted, because she then could become a support system for that person. It's absolutely amazing that someone would go that far. Did it work? Well, the couple came back to the village, but unfortunately, Herman Taylor absconded and went missing. He ran to the hills and was living rough there for several weeks while people tried to find him. He was found eventually at Sparks Down by Richard Gibb and brought into the poorhouse with his family. And this is interesting. Expenses were paid by the overseers of the poor for shaving Herman Taylor, cleansing his body and reclothing him. So you can only imagine what sort of state he was in at that stage. And I don't think the Southcombes' treatment had actually worked. Something was working though, because the following year, a little boy was born to the couple. But that's not the end of the story. The overseers of the poor did not give up on Herman. He obviously was not cured. So they spent even more money sending him then to Silverton for more conventional treatment from Dr. Sprague. He lived there with Dr. Sprague for 2 months and the parish again paid. And there's a nice little entry that then rounds off this story in the Overseers of the Poor accounts that said Dr. Sprague received £14 for curing Herman Taylor for a melancholy disorder. They spent an inordinate amount of the poor rate on this one poor labourer. He then died, sadly, but they tried. There was no stigma to the fact he'd been insane, and Catherine managed to remarry. So I think that's an example of caring for the poor rather than providing for the poor. So I'm going to have another look at housing now. Not all Lords of the Manor wanted a poorhouse next to the church. And Stockley English, which is quite a small village, William Ballou was the landowner, and he decided to put a piece of land aside so that the poor could be accommodated on that land in some sort of dwelling. This is the site. It's a little way to the west of that mansion house. It's at some Stockley Cross, it's called. Behind this gate, I think the poorhouses were along here. And so far as I can tell, there were 4 distinct partitions within this one building. I'd love to have known what it looked like. And the reason I know there were 4 distinct dwellings there, not distinct cottages, but distinct partitions, is because in the 1841 census, there are 4 distinct households named the poorhouse. Quick, Goss, Stone and Sharland are living there. Now you might think, the Crediton Union Workhouse was built in 1836, 37, and most people would then send the poor from their villages to be all together and looked after there. Why did this not happen in Stockley English? Again, I think it's about looking after your own. And these people we know had lived in the houses for a long time, because 20 years earlier, there were burials with the same name in the register at Stockley English, and after their names it said, an annotation, that they had lived in the poorhouse. But look, they are still living there until the last one, Anne Charland, died in 1867. So the Lord of the Manor allowed them to stay there, and they were supported by the poor funds. They lived out their natural lives in the places that they knew were home. Then, when there was no more use for that building, it was demolished. If you had a poorhouse, you had to have a very good person to run it. There was a poorhouse in Cruz Mortuard, but I'm afraid, even though there were 14 pensioners lodged there, the governor, or the master of the workhouse, was not running it well. He was fiddling the books. He was claiming more expenses from the overseers of the poor than he was spending on provisions. But that's not the worst of it. He was called Mr. Manley. He had a horse that he absolutely adored, and he housed it and stabled it in the workroom of the poorhouse at Cruz Mortuard. It was sick. He loved it dearly. As it was dying, it was groaning so loud, thrashing about so violently that people could hear it in the neighbourhood. It died in the poorhouse, and either he couldn't take it out or he wouldn't take it out, but the body, the carcass of it, started to rot and putrefy. And apparently the poor, the pensioners who were there, all 14 of them, became so ill that they had to be removed. The Lord of the Manor wasn't living in Cruz Mortuard at the time, so a letter was written to him by a Mr. Avery, putting him in the picture. And Mr. Avery was thinking, oh, there's a way out of this. There are villagers here who will look after these pensioners in return for some money from the overseers of the poor, an allowance. It will be cheaper. We won't have to pay for the upkeep of a governor or the building itself. He worked out it would be about £4 a head rather than a lot more for employing a new governor. So this was his pitch that he played to Samuel Cruz. Now, what I've put in red there is what I'm returning to. Do you remember that 1723 Act that had a clause in it that said poor relief could be subcontracted out to those that would feed, clothe and house the poor in return for a weekly rate from the parish? Bingo. I think that's what he is trying to say would be a better idea. Now, I don't know, because I haven't followed the story through in Cruz Mortuard, if that is what happened or whether the poorhouse continued to operate with a new governor. In the letter from Richard Avery, he mentions the sort of provisions that I'm afraid Mr. Manley was claiming too much for. So we know a little bit about their diet: wheat, butter, cheese, peas, and malt for the beer. And so here's a little bit of extra information about your typical menu in the poorhouse in the 1720s, up to the 1760s. So you'd have broth for breakfast, you'd have ½ ounce of butter and 4 ounces of bread, a hunk of bread, which would be about the same as 2 slices of bread is now. For lunch, you'd have another 2 slices of bread and a pint of flour milk, which was to bulk you out. And for supper, you might get a pint of beer. You'd also get another 2 slices of bread and maybe 2 ounces of cheese. And the recommendation was that you could have garden stuff or greenery once a week, and maybe once a week you might have 8 ounces of meat, not a very good quality meat. Now that's about subsistence level, isn't it? But I think in the Mid Devon parishes, agricultural areas, people would be set to work in the fields or mending the roads, and I think they would be able to scrump things. I'm pretty sure that their diet could be supplemented by nuts and berries, apples off the tree, raw vegetables, other things that they could find, and I don't think they would have been punished for picking up the odd extra bit of greenery. If you're in a town, however, with no access to those sort of windfalls, I think it would have been really tough. As well as the provisions, obviously, you've got to buy the work materials out of the poor rate. Here's a nice example of something unusual being bought by the overseers of the poor: oil, a slip of thread, shoes for William Hart, and this is the bit I like, a quart of yeast, a pound of treacle, and a quarter of flour of brimstone. Very nice. Obviously, they had a little bit of trouble with the diet. The last entry here is £2 of tea for the governess. The governess doesn't mean educational governess, it just means the wife of the governor or the wife of the master. So you had to get your money to go quite a long way. You'd need to provide candles, replacement bedding, etc. So it wasn't the easiest of jobs, because that poor rate was not finite. You only had a certain, it was finite rather, you only had a certain amount of money to distribute around. Going the extra mile again in Cadbury. This is a nice little example from the Overseers of the Poor records. 1775-6 was a dreadful winter. Land was under snow and ice for many weeks. Animals couldn't graze. You couldn't dig the root vegetables up. People were starving, and it was really, really cold. But in the Overseers of the Poor accounts, there's an example of them providing extra cloaks and blankets for the inmates, and £1.19 given away to the poor to help them out. So they could buy whatever provisions they could find, and they could buy firewood if they couldn't collect it themselves. Here's the entry with the purple stars. We gave away to the poor in that severe cold weather £1.19. You had to balance the books. So Cadbury again. If somebody died in the workhouse or in the poorhouse, you had a right to sell their clothing and their chattels if they had any. This comes from 1765, and it's about Absalom Escott. He must have been at one time in his life quite a gentleman, because by the look of his clothing, he wasn't your normal peasant. But his clothing was sold in what they called a survey, and that means an auction really, and the money that was made from it could go back into the coffers. Very interesting what was left. I'll just have a look, see if I can get my cursor on there. An old woolen shirt, a pair of breeches, a pair of buckles, a silk napting, a frock waistcoat and hat, a brown shirt, another shirt, a hat, 4 yards of cloth, 2 yards of fustian, and a coat. And I know that they outlaid sixpence to mend this coat so they could sell it. Let's see if they did balance the books. The amount that they spent on him, and very nicely, it wasn't just his coffin and grave and shroud, but they rang the bells at his funeral as well. Here's Roger Matthews mending the coat. They made £1, 5 and 6 from that auction. Oh no, they set out, sorry, they paid £1, 5 and 6 for looking after him, but they made £1, 14 and a penny. So a very good effort to balance the books. Now, here we come on to a very truncated part of what I was going to deliver to Newton St Sires. I'm just going to lay out a few facts for the great historians in that village to try and follow up. Newton St Sires, big parish, housing. Where would you house the poor? You'd have a substantial number of poor people in that village. It's large. You had a lord of the manor living there. You had an established church. Where was the poorhouse? What was done for them? How were they cared for? Well, the first clue I found is in 1691, where there's a lease of what looks like it could have been a poorhouse to James Towton. It's a chamber adjoining the churchyard, tick, with some rooms over and containing 20 foot by 12 foot, tick, nice long one, a little closet adjoining, and free liberty of the stairs, tick, called the churchyard stairs, to go to and from the said chamber. Is that the poorhouse, or is that what was going to be used as the poorhouse? There was obviously a great need and a lot of people who were poor, because just 4 years later, in 1695, there's an outbreak of smallpox in the parish. This is just taken from the burial register for 6 months. All those people are said to have died of the smallpox in the village at that time. A couple of them came from Upton Pine, but they died and were buried in the village. It was also Agnes, wife of John Quick, at the bottom, the yeoman, died as well. So you weren't, you know, it wasn't discriminating how poor or rich you were. But if you think about all those people dying, a lot of them are breadwinners. So that's immediately going to throw an awful lot of widows and children on the poor relief. They would need looking after. And sure enough, in the next few years in the burial register, I shall skip through these, but all these people were buried at Newton St Siars in the following years, and they were designated as poor in the register. A poor woman, a poor carpenter, a poor man, a poor labourer. The next year, a poor mason, a poor apprentice, a poor man's child. But, oh, look at this one. Mary Frost, widow, she had parish pay. Robert Parker, he had parish pay. Those two entries show that there was outdoor relief being paid to those two families that were in their own cottages and just needed some money from the poor rate. But the other people have been labelled poor, so they must have been being catered for somewhere within this village. The next year, even more of them. There's another Joanne Payne, she had parish pay. Richard Sear had parish pay, but those others are identified as poor. So the parish must have been taking care of them somewhere. By the time you get to 1702, the vicar's given up writing all of the whole wording of poor and just put the letter P there. So where were they being looked after? Is this the answer? 1714. Paid to Andrew Quick towards the land bought for the use of the poor of the parish of Newton St Siars. I thought I might have got there when I found this entry. I thought, oh, is this the way they're going to build a poorhouse for them all? But no. If you look at Sanford, and Mike Brett gave me these pieces of information the other day, in Sanford, Thomas Hayden gave £100 in land for the use and benefit of the poor. East Alladown of 20 acres was given for the use and benefit of the poor. Three-cornered close, 2.5 acres, was given for the use and benefit of the poor. And what it meant, because it's actually stated in Sanford, is it's the rents and profits from that land which is distributed to the poor. So it's not the place where a poorhouse was built. Let's have another look. Newton St Siars has obviously got property belonging to the parish for the use of the poor, because there are 2 bedsteads. Robert Bastable's looking after them. There's even a weaving loom that the poor will be using, and that's looked after by Edward Knapman. But where on earth are they being housed? And then I came across this. The overseers of the poor were given rent by James Gale. I don't know if that's any relation to our Mr. Gale, for the parish house at Newbridge. The parish house at Newbridge. They're also paying for the maintenance of this parish house at Newbridge. Oliver Arthur and his son are working on it. The workmen are given ale at the expense of the parish. Reeds and spars are being provided, floorboards, and even James Gale himself is being paid to work on the parish house at Newbridge. That's 1716. 1717, it's being thatched. John Goring's fixing the pump. Edward Jarman's fixing the oven there in this particular parish house. 1721, it's still there under James Gale. He's paying rent for this parish house. But then we have another complication in 1722. I've just emboldened it here because John Westlane is providing reeds for the lower parish house. So we've got more than one house being used to house the poor. Here's the A377 coming up from the bottom of the map from Exeter, going up to Newton St Sires. Where is the lowest parish house? Where is the Newbridge one? You all know that lay-by there, that big lay-by, and you all know where you can turn off to Langbridge and shoot. Well, I believe I'm right, that this is Newbridge. So where is Mr. Gale's parish house at Newbridge? Don't seem to be any buildings there now. So that's something that needs following up. But then we come back to this Workhouse Test Act again of 1723 that gives you the opportunity to subcontract out to those that would feed, clothe and house the poor in return for a weekly rate from the parish. This is what's happening, I am absolutely certain, in Newton St Sires. Even though it's an enormous parish, even though they've got buildings close to the church which could have been used, I think those who are capable of offering shelter in their cottages are receiving an allowance. And that's a movable feast. It means there's no one cottage which is always designated a poorhouse, because it depends on the tenants whether they are prepared to do it. And then we find in the Newton records some of these statements which I think support it. Widow Greenslade is paid for keeping Widow Ellis's child. Must be in her cottage. John Hayden for washing and lodging. John Fren is keeping, boarding and tending to Mary Lending. Must be in his cottage. William Roy is paid by the overseer of the poor for house room and for lodging and butt. So these cottages, I don't think you'll ever find where they were because it's a movable feast. There's still poor people staying in their own cottages, receiving outdoor relief, because we've got these entries here where they're getting money, and we've got these entries at the bottom here where they're getting support in kind. James Pitt's getting a pair of stockings, Thomas Pitt's a sheet, and shoes worn by the poor are being mended at the expense of the parish. So we're coming to the end of this sort of theory that I'm laying out for those historians in the village. So the parish house is there, and here is a story about Widow Ellis. 1768, a man and horse carry a bed to the parish house, and the Widow Ellis's bed and children are carried to town. Widow Greenslade is paid for keeping Widow Ellis's child. Widow Ellis, who is she? Very nice little scenario here. She's Mary Rue, who married John Ellis in 1767, and within 3 years they had 5 children, 2 sets of twins. All 5 of them, I believe, survived. John Ellis unfortunately died in 1767, so no doubt there was a lot of money outlaid on that family to look after them as paupers. Then we get later into the early 1800s where we've got people actually owning a house in order to house the poor. And we've got Mark Helmore, who's the grandson of the Mark Helmore we saw earlier, who was mending an oven. And we've got John Quick, Lord of the Manor. I don't think you'll ever find out where the houses that John Quick laid aside for the poor are in West Town, because he owned nearly all of West Town. And Mark Helmore, he died in 1825, and I had this thinking process going through that if he had a poor house, a house that he bought as a property owner in order to rent out to the poor, maybe he passed it down to his family. But 20 years later, or 30 years later, when the tithe map is drawn up, the only Helmore property I can find is 2 little cottages at Winscott, right in the sticks. So I don't think you can ever identify that one either. So I mentioned earlier that Crediton had a union workhouse built in 1836-37, which then soaked up all the poor from these outlying villages. After the Great Reform Act of 1834, listed there are all the villages that would feed into, if the villages wanted to, the poor. The impersonal setting, you're not in your neighbourhood, you're not near your family. It's an impersonal and perhaps punitive setting. Stockley English chose to keep their own poor. There might be other stories in these other outlying areas. You know where it is. It's not next to the church, right in the middle of a community where most poor houses were. It was right on the western outskirts of the town. And here are some photographs of it. And I think you could say that when we get to this stage, it is providing for the poor. In the Mid Devon parishes, I think I've probably argued enough to say it was caring for the poor by offering them housing and shelter, by offering them nourishment, sometimes supplemented, by looking after their health and their mental health, which is quite astounding. I'm sure that wouldn't have happened in the union workhouse. By looking after unmarried mothers and allowing them to leave and to have an independent life, ultimately supporting their children from outside, not being in the poorhouse with them. And by offering them real apprenticeships that would enable them to get a job and look after themselves in adulthood. All of that, what was happening in the parishes around Crediton, I think, was leading to rehabilitation. You weren't there forever. So that's the end of my little skittle through caring for the poor in some Mid Devon parishes.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Elly. That was really interesting. I'm just going to turn off your spotlighting and switch us into a gallery. If anybody wants to ask any questions of Elly, maybe you could just indicate so in the chat, either by typing the question or by just jotting down that you have a question that you'd like to ask. If anybody wants to turn on their video at this stage, and then they can do so and sort of join us in the virtual room as well. It's interesting, isn't it, Elly, looking at those documents, how some things just don't change. I was struck by that extraordinary expenses document where you have threepence being paid for oil, presumably to light the building, and threepence for a woman to wash, yes. And then 2 shillings for the governess's tea.
Yeah. There had to be some perks to the job.
The expense claims of those in charge have not changed in hundreds of years, so let's be honest. Okay, John has a question for Elly about villages. John, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself?
Yes, thank you.
No problem.
I thought it was an absolutely wonderful talk, Elly. It was not only interesting, it was very engaging, and it had a really interesting idea in it, which is that people were better cared for in the villages than in the later union workhouse. And what most surprised me about that, I have read bits of Liz Shakespeare and the awful experiences in North Devon of apprentices more or less enslaved to farmers up there, as she puts it.
Yeah.
But what you say is counterintuitive. To somebody like me, who's worked in a university, I think that people had a harder life in villages than in towns. Your evidence is absolutely wonderful evidence that that is wrong, that people were cared for, including in terms of mental health as well as all sorts of bodily things. And I wonder if that's a general principle which you found in your historical investigations, that people probably are better off in the main in villages than they are in big impersonal towns.
Well, John, that's exactly what I found. I mean, I've obviously not looked at a huge number of parishes, but it's in people's best interest to look after their own, isn't it? Otherwise, it comes back to bite you on the bum. They're going to grow up and they're going to be working on your land in a rural parish. So I don't think there would be as much money around in a village as there would be in a town. But I don't know. I mean, John Heel is the expert on the poorhouse in Crediton. And I think he'd probably be able to say from a town point of view, predating the Union Workhouse, if that was the case in a town. But there would be the added extras that you could pick up, the food that you could pick up in a village that you couldn't in a town. So my evidence is that. I mean, you can shoot me down in flames, but that's just as I found it on the pages of these particular documents.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that question. Tony's got his hand up. There's also a question which I'll take first, Tony, if you don't mind, in the chat from Richard, who's also on the screen with us. And Richard was asking there, when you refer to fostering, could the lord of the manor require somebody to look after people? That is, was fostering voluntary?
Do you know what? I've never found the lords of the manor engaged in any of this. It's the church, it's the church wardens, it's the overseers of the poor. I haven't really found that they took an active part in what was happening in the poorhouses in the villages I've studied, unfortunately.
Can I say that in that case, was whoever was giving the money to these people, could they impose it on the richer members of the community?
You mean the overseers of the poor?
Yes.
I think the overseers of the poor would in quite often, I found examples of them insisting on a farmer taking an apprentice. Yes. It's almost like there was a rota system. You haven't had any this year. You've got to take some, because they had to distribute them. I mean, there was money in it for them. There was an allowance. So it wasn't the worst thing in the world. But I think it's at that level that insistence takes place. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Tony, question from you.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, great talk, Elly. Thank you. Lots and lots of interesting strands coming up in that. I just wanted to start off by giving some thought on that question raised by Richard about manor versus parish. And one of them, manor versus parish versus church, essentially, I suppose. As you say, it's sort of post-Reformation, the church tends to be pulling away from its traditional role in terms of supporting the poor. The church has had most of its money taken away from it, which is no surprise. But the idea of the vestry, as it was originally, and is essentially the sort of the parish council of the time, that really starts to come in towards the end of the 16th century, when they have the responsibility for the care of the poor under those various pieces of legislation you mentioned. I think the role of the manor is a very, very minor by that time in terms of a responsibility for the poor. The other question I was originally intending to ask, though, it's really a comment as much as a question, is about this issue of why the change happened between parishes individually looking after the poor and then going into poor law unions. And one of the things which comes up time and time again is about resentment on the part of some people paying parish rates about the imposition that made on them. And the richer you were, the more you paid. Hooray, what a good opportunity, but not always liked by those who are the richest. So there was certainly a tremendous difference between individual parishes about the extent to which people were willing to pay their poor rate or really shamed into paying their poor rates.
Tony, in the area that we're talking about, I mean, Newton's at Sires possibly might fall into that, but a lot of those other parishes are very poor, so that you wouldn't have very rich people who would be paying that much. So
that yeah, okay, interesting thought. So in a sense, what you're suggesting there is that it wasn't so much a question of won't pay as can't pay. Yeah, so that in itself would have left those who were poor and who were in need of that support, that would have left them in a precarious state. So although how on earth can I find myself defending the poor unions? But essentially it was a way of making sure that there was at least some kind of very rough equality.
Equality, yeah. But you think the parcels of land that people were farming in those particular parishes I mentioned were not large anyway, so you couldn't levy a big rate from them because they're all sort of small holdings, really.
So you think of that thing with the Sphenum land system immediately before the 1830s, when the rates rose and fell according to the price of grain, as you mentioned.
Yeah,
that must have been really tough for all.
Very tough, yeah, absolutely, because they were all in the same boat, weren't they?
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you. Lovely comments. Great.
No, well, John Heel might know more about that. You know, the regularisation of payments, the fairness of it when the unions came in, because he's the expert on Crediton and the workhouse. I don't know Crediton really, I'm afraid. Did he come to the talk today? Is he here?
I can't tell from the participant list whether he is or not. No, not. So he I guess will catch up.
No answer there then.
No, I'm sure he can feed in later on once he's watched this if he wants to. Okay, does anybody else have a question that they would like to ask? I'll just have one more quick ask out for that. In the meantime, Pam just noted in the chat what a good presentation it was and how our government could learn a lot from this story.
John was here earlier on in the talk.
Oh, was he? Oh, it was that good, he left.
Maybe he was hungry. That's fine. He can give any information to us later on if he wants to. Okay, if there are no other questions, then I will ask you before we wrap up to just show your appreciation, however you normally do so in these, either on screen or in the chat or by any other method, to Elly for a fascinating talk. Lovely. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Elly.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
No, thank you. Nice to have a captive audience.
No, they can go with it. You wouldn't know.
Was there anybody out there?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, there were plenty. Okay, lovely. I will stop the recording at this point. Thank you so much, Elly.